Welcome to episode number 98 for the National Land Realty Podcast, where we discuss all things land. Our goal here is to inform, educate, and entertain those of you who own land or are interested in the buying and selling of land throughout the United States. My name is Mac Christian, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at National Land Realty. I'll be your host for this episode. So keep in mind, it is episode number 98, which means episode number 100 is creeping up on us. That will be live with some really fun guests. So today we're talking about chronic wasting disease, or CWD, if you hear it referred to in different publications. This is something that we've covered a lot in this podcast, and it's an issue that affects landowners across the United States as well as sportsmen all over the United States, and the problem is very, very real. Now, we've previously talked with Dr. Mike Chamberlain on the topic, and we have an upcoming episode with Doctor Sonja Christiansen. Now, today, we're talking about South Carolina Department of Natural Resources biologist Jay Cantrell, and we'll be discussing a very specific case of chronic wasting disease. What happens when you transport a chronic wasting disease infected deer across state lines? Well, you're about to find out. Now sit back and enjoy. So I am sitting here with Jay Cantrell, and Jay, I'm going to let you give your background here. I'm not going to know it nearly as well as you do. But so how did you get to working with it? You know, you're a biologist currently, and how did you get to your current place and your current position?
All right. Yeah. And yeah, I'm a wildlife biologist with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And I'm currently in our big game program, but I'll kind of start from the beginning and get back to that point. I'm a native of South Carolina, grew up here, and went to college at Clemson University and majored in wildlife biology there, and then went on and got a master's from Clemson as well in wildlife biology, and did research on deer in the coastal plain of South Carolina back in the late 90s, and then after grad school, got a job in Georgia with the Georgia DNR. Spent about 5 years over there doing some private lands work, technical assistance for landowners, and then some regional biologist work up in North Georgia, managing wildlife management areas. And then in 2005, came back home to South Carolina and spent 11 years in the low country of South Carolina in Hampton County at a place called the Webb Wildlife Center, which is one of our really large state-owned department-managed WMAs, about 26,000 acres on the Savannah River down in the lower corner of the state. Had a great time there, learned a lot, did a lot of, just land management, timber management, prescribed burning, running hunts, did some turkey research there. And then about, 8 years ago, came up to Columbia here to our headquarters and got into the big game program. So I'm the assistant big game program coordinator. And there's two of us in the program, myself and Charles Ruth. And so we do everything. Big game in South Carolina is deer, turkeys, and black bears. So we kind of handle everything at a statewide level for those three species. So that's, research, survey, monitoring, regulations, legislation, all sorts of things involving those species, harvest reporting and hunter surveys and population surveys and research projects. So, and obviously, a host of technical assistance and outreach and education. And then and part of that is obviously disease surveillance as well. And that's gotten to be a big thing in wildlife here in recent years, unfortunately. But so we do a lot with monitoring populations for diseases and doing surveillance. So that, kind of gets into our conversation today with chronic wasting disease in deer. So that's just another portion of the job.
So I got a couple side questions that I want to deep through the conversation because we're here today to talk about a specific event that happened in South Carolina where chronic wasting disease was inadvertently transferred across state lines from a harvest in another state. And the lawsuits that resulted from that and the reasons that that is dangerous. But I have a few questions I want to hit you with out of the gate here. One is, do you help set the harvest report or the harvest limits in certain areas? Is that something that you help manage as well?
Yeah. Well, what we do is we provide recommendations. In South Carolina, all of our seasons and bag limits and those type things are pretty much set through the legislature, our General Assembly. But we do provide recommendations to them, and collect data and information to help guide that process. So yeah, we're involved in it, but not the ultimate authority in it. So
okay, I wanted to clarify when you were talking about everything that you do at the Department of Natural Resources. I'm like, okay, this is you're all right. We might be talking to one of the most powerful people in the state right now.
Well, I don't know about
those
that,
limits. That's a big deal.
But we do provide guidance and recommendations when it comes to limits and seasons and those type things. And we have in the last few years, made a few changes there, and one of the big things that we've got coming, for deer is we're finally getting electronic harvest reporting, which has been needed for a while, and that's coming up this year. So we'll have better, data and information to work with for managing the populations by having more detailed harvest data. So we're looking forward to that. We've had it for a few years for turkeys and several years for bears, but we're finally getting all three big game species into the harvest reporting game, and with modern times and using mobile app and web-based reporting. So, but yeah, it's exciting and fun, and sometimes these are controversial species to work with, or they definitely get a lot of attention, But we spend a lot of time, working with the legislature on any kind of changes that come about. So right now we're in the midst of that with turkeys. We're trying to do some changes to our turkey seasons and bag limits and whatnot to try to deal with some of the declines we're seeing in turkeys. But yeah, that's part of the job as well.
And then the other question I had, and this is just a more of an overhead question. So the game management in South Carolina falls under the Department of Natural Resources. And the one thing I know, like out west in Idaho, it's Fish and Game that does those things. Is that just weird out west? Is it just named different things in different states, or what is the naming convention there?
Yeah, it just varies state to state. A lot of states are a Department of Natural Resources. Some are Fish and Game, some are Fish, Game and Parks, or Fish and Wildlife, Commission. It just kind of varies state to state. And some of those change over time. I think we used to be the Wildlife and Marine Resources Department, and so. But I think DNRs, Department of Natural Resources, is fairly standard, at least in this part of the country. But yeah, you hear all kind of different naming, concepts there, and I think some of it depends too on, or some of these, like a state cabinet agency, or some of them, a lot of them are a commission to where they have appointed commissioners for the, from different parts of the state that kind of the department answers to. Like where I said, we're a legislative state in South Carolina. We, any game and fish laws go through the legislature, but in a lot of states they go through a wildlife and fisheries commission. So it's kind of a board of sorts, a board of commissioners that approve any changes in laws and seasons and bag limits. And some is kind of a hybrid. Some, maybe they have a commission that deals with seasons and bag limits, but the legislature would deal with things like license fees or anything on a monetary scale. So it kind of varies state to state. But yeah, we're and I know, like, our neighboring states are a little different. North Carolina's Wildlife Resources Commission, and
Yeah,
Georgia is a DNR, but they have a Wildlife Resources Division within that. And everybody's a little different. So.
Going state to state, it's always a kind of. I feel like all the states need to get together.
Just get a uniform name.
Just pick one name. Can you do that? No.
Yeah, and I think, generically, people talk about just fish and game agencies, and I think that's kind of a catch-all. But yeah,
throws me off whenever I see. Anyway, side note. I was just curious. Okay, so we're here to talk about a very specific circumstance that happened in South Carolina. And for those of you listening, this is a case where an animal was harvested. You were talking just before this, and I'll let you I'm going to let you take the reins, because obviously I have no idea what happened, right? I'm completely clueless on this subject. But the details that we have are a game animal was harvested in Kansas, and the head was brought into South Carolina. It was later found out that head had chronic wasting disease, tested positive, and from that, we have a giant legal kerfuffle that erupts from this and gets managed across multiple states.
Right.
So it's super interesting story, and it's one to pay attention to, because right now, as we were just talking, South Carolina does not have chronic wasting disease in the state. Now, it's probably, given that it's around South Carolina, a matter of time before it goes in, but that gives more conversation. We'll kind of get into what is being done beforehand and what sort of best practices have been, because you're going to be one of the tip of the spear states to see if you can take care of it before it gets in. It's going to be it's going to be a thing, whether you guys can hold that off or not.
Right.
So that's another conversation to have, but we're going to talk about this specific case. So walk me in, Jay, if you could, sort of what happened around this and how was this found out?
Okay. So the way this kind of started, there were some individuals from South Carolina that had a history of going out to Kansas. I don't know if it was every year, but most years, to deer hunt. It was just kind of an annual or almost annual trip that they would make and drive to Kansas and hunt for several days and drive back. And we first kind of made contact with these individuals in 2017, when they had come back from a trip and brought several deer heads to a deer processor in South Carolina, and we didn't catch them at the time, but found out after the fact they had done this, and by doing that they had violated South Carolina law, because we've had a law on the books since 2004 for 20 years now that is basically a carcass import ban. So the gist of it is that you cannot bring certain carcass parts, and they're listed in the law, but it's basically things that would be of concerns for CWD infected parts, things like the head, spine, that's kind of the main thing. Any part of the deer head or spine, what you can bring back, and that's from a CWD positive state. So if you're hunting in a state that doesn't have chronic wasting disease, you're fine. But those are getting fewer and fewer. But if you're coming, if you've been hunting in any state that has chronic wasting disease, you can't, you can only bring back basically a finished taxidermy or a clean skull or clean skull cap, a hide. You can bring back meat, either boned out meat or you can bring quarters, but no part of the spine. So you can bring shoulders and hams, but no part of the backbone or spine, no part of the head, because that's the main infective parts of CWD are in the brain and spinal cord and eyes and tonsils and lymph nodes and those type things. So what we're trying to do is not prevent people from being able to hunt out of state and bring back game, but just they can't bring back the high risk parts, because the reason would be if those parts weren't disposed of properly, were just left out on the landscape, somebody throws them out in the woods or in a shallow pit, they could infect the environment or infect deer here. And so it's just a way that chronic wasting disease can be spread is through obviously moving live deer is probably the most dangerous thing, but moving infected carcass parts is another high risk activity that could bring chronic wasting disease into South Carolina. So we've had that law on the books for 20 years that does not allow these certain parts to come back from other states. And so what these guys did, and they went in 2017, had violations. It was after the fact. We educated them well on what they had done. But fast forward 2 years to 2019, and they do it again after they had been, well educated. And we had done, and I can get into it in a minute, we've done a lot of education of hunters in general. We have not tried to hide this regulation. We've tried to make people very aware of it. Any rate, 2019, they're been in Kansas and they're coming back, and our law enforcement folks get wind of it and intercept them when they get back into South Carolina. And I believe they had, I can't remember, I think it was 3 deer heads that they were coming back with, not caped out to where they would be legal. For it to be legal, they would have had to have just the hide and a clean skull cap. But these were just like a hunter would kind of cape one to take it straight to a taxidermist, that still had all the neck and head. So those were seized.
So just to clarify, so you can have, if it's been through a taxidermist,
mm-hmm.
it's good to go.
It's good to go.
Or do you have to have, and just to kind of dive into the finer points, are you able to say boil the head and that is good, or do you need a write-off from a taxidermist that they worked on it and cleaned it properly?
All right, so yeah, there's and that's good to get into because this comes up a lot. So yeah, obviously finished taxidermy is fine, or a clean boiled skull, like a European mount type skull, exactly, but it needs to be clean, like finished, done, nothing left in it, so that's fine. And then what we tell a lot of people, because obviously people that are bringing back a trophy, a lot of them want to use their taxidermist here at home. And we say that's fine, but it needs to be that you're bringing just the cape, just the hide, and then the clean skull cap, because that's all the taxidermist is going to use on a deer mount is the antlers and that little piece of skull that are holding them, and then the hide. And so what we tell people is either one, learn how to do that yourself, and there's YouTube videos and whatnot online, or, you can learn how to properly cape and get that hide off, or find a taxidermist close to where you're hunting out of state and just pay them a fee to do that, because they do that all the time. That's the first step of mounting a deer is to get, the cape off, the hide off, and cut that skull plate off. And so we tell them that, look, there's not a taxidermist out there that for the right fee won't do that for you and let you bring it home. And that's fine to bring that back, And so, these guys had been educated that that's what they needed to do. They needed to either do it themselves, get it done out there and ship back, or find somebody there that could strip the hide off and give them a clean skull cap, and they could bring that back and everything would be fine. They chose not to do that and came back with, these whole heads. And so once we got, our hands on them and got the samples that we needed, and basically what you're doing is extracting a couple lymph nodes that are in the neck of the deer for testing. So we got those samples and sent them to the lab, and lo and behold, one of these deer comes back CWD positive. So that immediately elevated the urgency of this case. We've made other cases over the last several years of people illegally bringing back deer heads. We've tested every deer that's come in. We've never had a positive. Those folks got tickets, state charges for violating that law. But in this case, because it was positive, it really got everybody's attention, and so they started looking into it a little bit more. And the other thing about these laws, every state has something like this now, to where you can't either bring something from a CWD positive state, or a lot of states have it where you can't bring anything from any other state. And so we started talking to states between South Carolina and Kansas, to see if anybody else was interested in pursuing charges against these guys, because every state they had gone through, they had violated the law, just going through those states.
This is a lot of states getting involved at this point, because they've crossed state line, and it's one of those. And just to clarify what you said to anybody listening that is curious why this is a big deal. So chronic wasting disease, when it gets to the point where they test positive, means that the prion is in the cerebrospinal fluid, right? And it's it's a clear liquid that houses the brain and the spinal cord, and it gets into there, and that's where it becomes, at that point, it's extremely infectious, to where a drip from that, if something drips out, if it touches something, then that prion's on the ground.
Yep.
And you can't kill it. You can't heat it up and have it go away. It's not going to freeze and go away because it's not alive. And that becomes an infectious agent that is on the ground in that area for the duration,
for years, decades or something. Yeah. So and again, that's a good point. Why would somebody care if it had passed through their state? Well, like I said, if it was in a garbage bag in the back of the truck and leaking, and they, stop somewhere and some of that gets on the ground, then it has the potential to spread infectious prions anywhere along their route coming back. So we, mainly because they had blatantly violated the law after they had been educated on what to do and how to properly bring something back, and they chose to ignore that. And then two, because they brought something back that was positive, we felt the need to let other states know that, hey, a positive CWD deer passed through your state. So we started looking into that, and then also started at the source in Kansas, where these guys have been hunting. And our law enforcement folks started talking to the law enforcement guys in Kansas about this case and these guys. And then, I don't know all the nitty-gritty details on it, but the gist of it was, with some investigation on the Kansas side, they learned that these guys had a violation in Kansas while they were there. And so that's where this thing really kind of got elevated, because they would have been facing, state charges here for violating the carcass importation ban, and potentially some state charges in some other states that said, we'll jump on board with this thing. Every state they went through didn't, but there was, I think, if I recall, a couple states that said, we'll pursue something. But then once we found out they had violated the law in Kansas, and basically what it was they had taken illegal deer in Kansas. I think, if I recall right, they didn't have proper tags, or took more than they had tags for, or were hunting, I think, with a tag for one zone, but killed a deer in a different zone or something. Anyway, they had serious violations and had illegally harvested deer in Kansas. And they then knowingly transported illegally taken deer in Kansas back to South Carolina. And when that happens, they triggered something called the Lease Act, which is a federal law that covers a lot of things. But basically, it's illegal to knowingly transport illegally taken wildlife across state lines. So they had, now gone from just having a state violation in South Carolina, or potentially maybe a couple other states jumping on with state violations, to getting the attention of the feds and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the case got turned over to the feds, and for those people who know a lot about federal prosecution, it takes a little bit of time, and this also happened during COVID, which really slowed things down too, because federal courts weren't moving a lot of cases at that point in time. So this thing kind of drug on, and there was a lot of investigation in it. It had to do with a lot of technology and search warrants and whatnot. But at the end of the day, they ended up being charged with Lacey Act violations, and there was 3 individuals, and they all worked out plea deals in federal court, and got substantial penalties. One of them got worldwide hunting ban for 3 years, and $15,000.
Worldwide, not just national. Worldwide.
Yeah, worldwide. Worldwide hunting ban for 3 years, and about $15,000 in fines and restitution. One got a worldwide hunting ban for 2 years and about $8,000 in fines and restitution. And one got a 1 year worldwide hunting ban and about $4,000 in fines and restitution. So between the 3 of them, about $27,000 in fines and restitution, and that's not including whatever their attorney fees cost them in this whole process. So it was quite an expensive venture for them.
And this is after a plea. So the original, everything stacked up against them originally, they got out.
Yeah, I mean, the potential, fines and jail time and whatnot would have been much worse. And like a lot of people will tell you, if you ever get in trouble with the feds, you better take a plea, because they're not going to pursue you unless they know they got you. And if you go to trial, it's going to be much worse. So they all worked out plea agreements between their attorneys and federal prosecutors, and some of this was restitution paid to the state of Kansas, and then some of it was federal fines, and then the worldwide hunting ban. So it escalated quickly, as they like to say. And had it just been state violations here, it would have been, I think ours is a $465 fine, and probably some points on their hunting license here, but nothing as severe as what they had. And they lost the deer heads too. Those were all confiscated. So it was a prime example of what can, how bad it can get if you violate wildlife laws, and then particularly if you violate laws and then transport, the illegally taken wildlife across state lines. So, that's really what got this case a lot of attention, and it kind of showed up in the media. Because I think, when people saw these, when the media got wind of the fines and hunting bans, and I think some of the initial thought was that was what happened for just bringing, CWD positive deer back to South Carolina, which would be nice if we could have that kind of punishment and hammer for people doing that. But no, it was more that, what they had done in the interim. But as I'd like to tell people, it's a good, example of why we do have laws in place, because, we had a a real opportunity for CWD to be brought back into the state had we not, caught these guys and intercepted that deer and gotten it tested and then disposed of properly. So that's why we do this. That's why we have these laws on the books to try to keep this disease out.
Yeah, and did South Carolina find out about this, the transport of this? Because originally it wasn't known if it was chronic wasting disease positive. Did you catch? You said they were waiting for them. Did they even get into the state, or did you have to go? Was there the possibility, I guess, that they infected other areas that you didn't know about?
They were caught pretty quick after they got into the state. So we feel pretty good that, hopefully, now obviously, as we were just talking, there's a risk of something, dripping or whatnot. But as far as at least the deer head wasn't, disposed of improperly and all that infectious material just put out onto the landscape. So, we feel like pretty good chance there was no infection, but that's about as close as, you can get. Had we not, had some intel that these guys were out there hunting and bringing back deer, not made this case, because I'm sure there's cases where, that slip by us. There's people that hunt out of state and bring back deer. And obviously, as I said, there's been cases made every year, but we don't catch them all. But that's kind of the educational component of this too, is to say, hey, this can happen and it does happen, and that's the insidious thing about CWD is, and if people don't know it, we can kind of talk about the disease, but one of the biggest problems with it is it has a long incubation period, and deer can appear otherwise healthy, outwardly looking at the deer, but can be infected and contagious. And so you could, very conceivably shoot a deer that you think, oh, that's a healthy deer, it looks normal, but it has CWD. It just has not advanced to the clinical symptomatic stage yet, but it's still infectious and capable of spreading the disease. So I think that's the real danger, as somebody goes out of state, harvest a deer or an elk that they think, oh, that's a perfectly healthy animal I just killed. I don't need to worry about that. I can bring this back. It's not a sick animal. But it is, because you can't tell until you do the lab testing on it. And so that's really what we've tried to make people aware of, is to say, hey, this, at some point these animals do get clinically sick and have symptoms. And most people would be able to tell that's not a healthy animal, but that can take, a year and a half or 2 years or more, before an animal gets to that symptomatic point. But that doesn't mean they're not diseased and not capable of transmitting the disease and have infected parts. And what most people want to bring back are the most infected parts. It's the head and the spine. And our concern is how, once it gets back, how is that handled and disposed of? And how, what could be infected in the process? And if a deer parts are just tossed out onto the landscape, then that's high risk. So that's kind of our big thing is, as you mentioned, we're one of 2 states in the Southeast that don't have it, and we're trying to put everything in place we can to keep it that way as long as possible.
Yeah, so let's kind of jump into sort of what it is real quick. A prion is a protein, and for all definitions, it's just a bent protein, right? Like that's kind of what it comes down to. Is it's just got a funny bend in it.
Yeah. Yeah, so CWD is a prion disease, and like I said, a prion is a protein And so, most diseases that people are familiar with are either, bacterial or viral or occasionally fungal. And so that's a little easier to kind of wrap your brain around something that, has, bacterial or viral base. But this is caused by this, misshapen protein that basically these prions are normal in mammals. We have prions. All animals have prions, and they are just a protein that has some function in the body. That's probably some kind of intercellular communication or something, and they're kind of short-lived in the body. They do their whatever their task is, and then they get broken down into their amino acid parts and go away. Well, these bad prions are misshapen, and they don't break down, and they stay in the body. And then for whatever reason, when they get into the brain, they end up killing neurons in the brain. And so when they do that, they leave a little hole in the brain. And so that's, CWD is in the family of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So the transmissible means it's contagious, can be spread from animal to animal. Spongiform, so it means it leaves holes, and encephalopathy means it affects the brain and nervous system. So these prions get in, an animal ingests one of these disease prions. It then encounters normal prions, but then somehow the messages them to have this malform. And so it's kind of a chain reaction cascade event to where you end up over time getting more and more of these disease prions in the body, and they tend to kind of want to make their way to the nervous system, the spinal cord and brain and lymph nodes. And like I said, when they get in the brain, they end up setting up shop and killing neurons. And so over time, you just get all these little spongy holes in the brain. And then when it hits kind of a critical mass and there's enough of that, then you start getting neurological symptoms because the brain is not functioning properly anymore. And that's when these deer, or other, elk, moose, whatnot, start having these outward symptoms, after it's kind of hit that, it takes a long time for it to build up like that and get to a point. But eventually after, year and a half, 2 years or so, they start getting symptomatic. And, and that's things like, as the disease is called, wasting disease, they just kind of waste away. They lose a lot of weight. They lose a lot of body condition. Their hair coat looks terrible. They, have excessive drinking and urination, excessive salivation, head tremors, and staggering, kind of lose their balance, stand with a wide stance. Basically they just kind of waste away physically, and then mentally, they're neurologically, they just start getting, they're just kind of out of it. They lose their balance, they lose their sense of awareness, and they're just kind of, in a state, and I hate the term, but you see the media sometimes call this zombie deer.
I was gonna use that word. I was waiting for that.
Yeah, and I hate that, but it is kind of, they just are kind of in this zombie state where they're just out of it. They just don't have any awareness of what's going on around them. And then eventually, just from lack of eating and the disease, starting to affect other parts of the body, they just kind of waste away and die. So it's 100% fatal. And obviously, it doesn't necessarily kill all the deer. Some of these deer will start getting symptomatic and will die of something else. We think a lot of them are probably more prone to roadkill and being killed by predators because they're not quite with it mentally. They're probably not making good decisions, or they're not aware of their surroundings. And so a lot of them succumb to other mortality factors. But the bottom line is, no deer's ever recovered from it, or eventually it's going to kill them if something else doesn't kill them first.
And it's not like you can inoculate, well, as of right now, there's no cure for it because most of our medical technology is oriented towards killing something, right? To kill a bacteria or to eliminate a virus. I mean, there's not a whole lot. There's antivirals out there, but viruses are very difficult to deal with. You kind of just let them run their course,
Right.
but they run a course. Viruses tend to run a course, and your immune system takes care of it.
Yeah.
Bacteria, you can do things about it to kill the bacteria. Fungicide, you can use an antifungal agent,
Yeah.
for a fungal infection. But a prion disease is like,
Yeah, there's no treatment, no cure, no vaccine, because like you said, it's not one of those typical uh pathways of a disease, to be transmitted by, bacteria or virus. Um and there's these type diseases, and it's not just in deer, and I think, some people probably know this, but there these, CWD is in deer, um, but similar diseases, bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease in cattle that a lot of people have heard of, a disease called scrapie in sheep. There's a feline version and a mink version. And even in humans, there's something called Crutchfield-Jakob disease. So there are, other diseases out there in the same kind of family, these prion diseases, spongiform encephalopathy diseases, that affect other species and even humans. Um, they're all usually species specific. They don't cross species barriers. Like there's no evidence so far that CWD can go to other species. And similar, excuse me, mad cow disease did cross over into humans. So that's a concern, for us. But yeah, it's not a disease that there's a known way to treat it or handle
yeah,
it. And so that's kind of one of the big concerns. And like you mentioned earlier, it's not easy to deal with the disease agent. There's, even, with bacteria and viruses, as you mentioned, with, antibiotics or antivirals, but there's also good ways to kill those infectious agents, with UV light or heat or chemicals or something. And so far, these prions seem to be very resistant to all that. High heat and extreme cold doesn't really kill them or denature them. UV light doesn't seem to have any effect. So it's not an easy thing. Once it's established, it's really hard to get rid of. I think what really opened people's eyes on that was years ago there was a captive deer herd out west, that got CWD, and they went in and depopulated the whole enclosure. Killed everything in there and left it alone for a few years, and then put some deer back into that enclosure. And those deer contracted CWD just from, it was in the soil, it was in the
yeah.
dirt. So that's the big concern, is that, once it, it transmits deer to deer, obviously, just because the way it's transmitted is through bodily fluids, saliva, urine, etc. But it also, so directly deer to deer, you can get infection, but deer can infect the environment, through urine and saliva. And so that's the big concern too. This can spread at a scrape for deer or a feeding area for deer. And so that's the big concern, is once you get it, you've kind of got it. There's not a good way to, and it doesn't, run its course. Some of the other deer diseases, we deal with, like hemorrhagic disease in deer, and that's a viral disease, but it, like a lot of viral diseases, will kind of run its course, and you'll get immunity in the herd, and then it goes away. And that's also a seasonal thing because it's transmitted by an insect, and so there's not an insect vector for this disease that you can deal with, and it's not a seasonal thing. It's not, it's just one of those things, that it's very concerning because all the typical things we know about managing diseases don't work. here.
Yeah.
And so there's, obviously a lot of research, but again, a lot of the funding for disease research gets into things that are either have a human health component or a, agriculture, domestic or production agriculture, livestock component. And for something that's just a wildlife disease, unfortunately, the amount of funding is just not as abundant. And so there is plenty of research going on, but it's not at the level of something that would be for a human disease. So we'll see. And like I tell people, in South Carolina, we're doing all we can to keep it away as long as possible to hopefully allow the science and the research an opportunity to learn more. And and maybe at some point in the future we will come up with some type of treatment or something. There's definitely efforts going in that direction, but it's going to be kind of probably a long way in the future.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to ask you real quick for a closeout question. As one of the states in your area that does not currently have it, how do you approach management for that? How do you kind of preemptively try to stack the deck for yourselves before it gets in, and so that you can manage it if it does?
Okay. Yeah. Well, two things. I'll kind of talk about, what we've done preventative, from a prevention standpoint, and then kind of how we're planning and preparing for the future. So obviously the import ban that we've talked about, we've had that in place for years to try to prevent these high risk carcass parts from coming from other states. So that's, one way that we try to keep it out. And then about 5 years ago, we put a urine ban in place to where, we banned the use of commercial deer attractants and lures that have real urine in them, because that's a way it can spread. There are synthetic products out there that people can use, but we put that in place
and stuff like that people use.
Yeah. So that's kind of, and we've historically had a ban on live deer importation. And, we've never had deer farming or deer breeding or, those type things in South Carolina that a lot of other states do. People might be aware that, there's a lot of states that have, high fence operations for deer breeding or deer farming or deer hunting in these enclosures. And those also, obviously are moving a lot of deer, kind of deer peddling, deer being sold and moved around. And so those are obviously real high risk issues. And that's what I tell people a lot of times. We're in real good shape because we've never had that. And that's probably one of the, the most likely ways CWD is going to get across state lines is, a live deer and a livestock trailer. So we've done all we can really to, prevent some of this stuff from, no live deer importation, carcass ban importation, and urine ban. And then we've done a lot in the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years of just public education. We really ramped up our messaging through social media and, emails and posters at deer processors and taxidermists and hunting stores, and then direct messaging to deer hunters. We're fortunate that every deer hunter in South Carolina has to have deer tags, and we mail those tags to them. So we have a great opportunity there to also directly message these people. So we'd have, inserts and messaging on the tags and envelopes. And so we've done just a multimedia approach to getting the word out of what CWD is, what are the risks, and, what not to do and what to do. And so I feel like, that's, obviously enforcement and laws are one thing, but education is the biggest thing, to make hunters aware of the disease and make them aware of what risky behaviors are and things to do and not do. So we've done that. And then we also have a response plan, a CWD response plan in place. So when and if it does get here, we're not all of a sudden scrambling and trying to figure out what to do. We've got a a plan, a detailed plan in place that kind of sets up a disease management zone. Because obviously the thing you want to do if you get it is to try to contain it,
Right.
and try to slow the spread of it, and keep it contained to a small area. So you get into a lot of surveillance, a lot of collection and surveillance, doing a lot of testing in that area where you first detect it, and try to determine the prevalence of the disease and the extent of it. How far has it gotten geographically, and then to try to keep it in that zone. So there would be regulations put in place that would prevent deer parts and carcasses from leaving that zone and going to other parts of the state. Limitations on where you could take deer to dispose of parts or to process them. We probably cut out rehabilitation of fawns in those areas. A lot of states at that point have cut out baiting. We have baiting in the state, a ban on baiting in that area. But anyway, we would have the potential and the authority to have some regulatory power and this delineated disease management zone, and to try to keep it contained, because that's kind of, obviously once it's there, you're not going to get rid of it, but you want to slow that spread and keep it in as small area as possible. And so along those lines, the other thing is too, if it gets here, you want to detect it as quickly as possible. So we're doing surveillance to where we work with taxidermists, because CWD is most likely going to show up in adult bucks. That's where it's most prevalent, is in adult bucks, just because of their behavior by nature. They're covering more ground, they have larger home range, they're coming in close physical contact with a lot of other deer, sparring with other bucks, breeding with does. So just by their behavior and their nature and their habits, adult bucks get CWD more than other deer. And so if you're looking for it, trying to find it, you want to look at adult bucks. And that's obviously, it's more prevalent in them. So that's, you're cutting your effort if you're doing monitoring and surveillance, if you're looking mostly at adult bucks. And so obviously that's what's ending up at taxidermists. So we contract with taxidermists all over the state to collect samples for us, because when they're caping out a deer, getting it ready to mount, when they're stripping the hide off, they're right at what we're looking for, which is called these retropharyngeal lymph nodes. That there's two lymph nodes that sit kind of right behind the Adam's apple, the larynx on the deer's neck. And so we pay them to collect those and put them in a little sample pack and freeze them and label them. And then we send those to a laboratory to be tested. So we're doing active surveillance to try to, because the idea is if it gets here, when it gets here, we want to find it as quickly as possible so we can minimize and cut down on that spread. So that's what we're doing. And we've, not just doing that on a haphazard approach. We've kind of worked with Cornell University in New York, and they have a risk assessment program. And we, you put in kind of the deer density, the population estimate for a county, and then, there's a whole host of things that kind of go into this, how many processors, how many taxidermists, how close to a state line are you, various risk factors, and it kind of scores or ranks the counties in the state highest to lowest risk. And then you want to collect obviously more samples in the higher risk counties. So right now, a lot of, we're sampling all over the state, but our border with North Carolina is obviously higher risk. North Carolina has CWD. It's our, the neighboring state that, Georgia to our south does not have it, but North Carolina does, and has it in a couple different locations in North Carolina. One of them only about 50 miles from our state line. So we're obviously sampling heavy along the North Carolina line, thinking that, if it gets to South Carolina, that's the most likely place it would show up first. Not that it could pop up anywhere from illegal importation, but that's the highest risk. So, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're doing surveillance, we're doing education, and we're trying to enforce the laws and regs we have in place. And then we've got a plan in place, once it does get here, so we'll know, we'll have, plan to how to react and how to set up the disease management zones and how we would manage going forward. So that's kind of all you can do. And then just kind of keep tabs on things. And the longer this disease is around and the more states get it, we obviously talk to our counterparts in other parts of the country, and particularly other parts of the Southeast that have CWD, and see how they're managing. We have groups, we've got deer biologists from other states, and we get together a couple times a year and have discussions. And we've got a CWD group that, has bi-monthly conference calls. And so, it's a lot of sharing information with other states and seeing what they're dealing with and what they're learning, and keeping up on, their latest findings or whatnot. So it's kind of a regional approach, really. Everybody's trying to work together and share information and share knowledge. And we've learned a lot, since, this thing really kind of got the attention in this part of the country in 2002. It had pretty much been a Western disease, up until that point, but it got to Wisconsin in 2002, and it kind of opened everybody's eyes in the eastern part of the country. And but in the last 22 years, we've learned a lot. And like I said, every time a new state gets it, we learn some more. And so, like I said, all we're trying to do is, be realistic and know that it's going to get here at some point, but put everything in place that we can to try to prolong that as far as possible, and then be as prepared as we can when it does get here, so we can, react, but not overreact.
Right.
That's the other thing too, is, we want people to keep deer hunting, and it's not the end of deer. It will change things, for sure, and have an impact. But, that's the other thing too. We don't want people to panic, it'll just kind of, be a little bit of a change of pace for people in the area that have it, and what they can do and what they can't do. But we want it to be as least impactful on hunters as possible, and allow them to kind of help us manage it. That's kind of what we'll do. And there'll be probably more liberal seasons and bag limits in the area that has it, to try to keep deer densities down, because it's a density dependent disease as far as spread. The higher your deer density, the faster it will spread, because that's just the nature of it. Anything that's contagious like that. So we're not trying to wipe out deer, but if it gets here, obviously the area it shows up, we'll want to keep deer densities as low as possible in those areas to slow the spread of it. But yeah, we're just kind of preparing for the worst and hoping for the best, I think. So. But as I tell people, eventually it'll walk in. We can do all we want, as far as bans and laws and whatnot, but at some point, an infected deer is just going to walk across the state line, and we'll have it like that, and we'll deal with it. But it's something that we don't. I'm hoping it's several years from now. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jay, I appreciate you going through this information.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's one of those notes, for anybody out there, if you go to another state to hunt, be aware of the regulations. And you're going to have to look into it. You're going to have to do a little homework to do it, because it's not like that information just gets put in front of everybody. I mean, if you're working with an outfitter, chances are they'll probably let you know, because they'll be familiar with it. But be super cautious with it. Make sure you've done your own research, and don't sit back and rely on other people just to tell you information that you should know. You go find it, so that you don't end up in a situation like that. And granted, it sounds like these folks who harvested the deer weren't following the law anyways. But for you law-abiding citizens out there, you could even get in hot water just by not knowing what the laws are. So make sure that you follow up on that. And Jay, thank you for all the work you're doing in South Carolina. Hopefully you can keep this thing out of your state.
We hope so.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, I appreciate your time. Thank you very, very much. And we'll have a link to your department and everything in the podcast, to make sure people want to get back and see the work that you do.
Sounds great. Appreciate it.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome.
This concludes episode number 98 for the National Land Realty Podcast, talking about chronic wasting disease with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources wildlife biologist Jay Cantrell. You can learn more about land ownership and the buying and selling of land at nationalland.com.